good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, depending on where you are. It's a real pleasure to be able to have this time with you. Thank you for your interest in our webinar, during which we'll explain a little bit about the content of our book, The Customer Copernicus, How to Be Customer-Led. Being customer-led has been a fascination of all of us here. We'll try to share with you how we've learned about this topic and what we've come to know, and why we think it's really interesting and well worth some serious consideration. I'm joined today by Charlie Dawson, who is my co-author in this project, and great friend for the last 25 years, 30 years. We met in London many years ago. I was working on my PhD at the time. He was the managing director of an ad agency there called Duckworth Finn Grubb Waters. They were working on an amazing project for Daewoo, launching the car into the United Kingdom, and they broke all the rules and broke all the records. It was an amazing learning journey for Charlie and for his colleagues at the agency. And it was something of great fascination to me because it was putting in practice a lot of what I was learning about and advocating for. Since then, Charlie has developed his own consulting firm called The Foundation, dealing with just this issue. That's a long road for an engineer from Cambridge, and he's really focused a lot now on business models which are customer-led. We are joined, and we're very happy to be joined by another engineer, Paul Cobban. Paul Cobban is the Chief Transformation Officer at DBS, the Development Bank of Singapore. DBS is the world's best digital bank. That organization has transformed dramatically, so dramatically, in fact, that Harvard Business Review remarks that it is one of the top 10 transformations in the last decade, completely moving from inside out to outside in. And he'll share a little bit with us about his journey. Paul has spent his career in financial services. After earning his degree, he went to IBM, and after IBM, a long period in the different major big financial banks that you'll have heard of all over the world, the big internationals, and for the last decade has been guiding DBS on its transformation journey. We're all very engaged in this topic, and we hope you will be too. I'm hoping that you can see our screen. So when Charlie and I started this project, I think it's important to say that we knew we had a shared interest in this topic, and a long shared interest in this topic. We'd been exchanging ideas for a long time, and we'd come across a few interesting nuggets, and we thought we should write them up. We should make them available to people. We should argue about them. We should learn more about them, go into more depth. And one rainy night in London, we decided to write a book. That was a long time ago, and we've had many learnings and challenges along the way. But what we didn't want to do was write another book, which would simply be a collection of what we can all agree are good practices in customer centricity. What we actually wanted to do was answer a few questions that for us really needed to be answered. One was, what the heck do we mean by being customer-led? We talk about customer focus, customer centricity, customer-led, putting customer first. They all mean different things to different people. Let's try to figure out what we really are trying to get at. And given that this whole customer prioritization is attractive for companies, and we see lots and lots of evidence, why is that actually so rare? Why do we see more customers dissatisfied than satisfied? Why, when some companies understand exactly how to do this, they lose it? They don't persist over time. They were once customer-led and fantastic and doing really well, and then they're not. What's going on? What we mean by customer-led is really a trailblazing idea. It's an organization that understands what customers value, the problems or the solutions that they're looking for, the problems they're trying to solve, the solutions and outcomes that they want, not the products themselves, not the services themselves. And that creates that value in new and better ways. So it's innovative, and they innovate on behalf of the customer. They move industries as a result of that. And that's why we like to focus on the idea of pioneers and trailblazers. That's what we mean by customer-led. It's kind of obvious that it's a good thing to do. Peter Drucker has been talking about this, or was first talked about this in 1954, and really gave the idea some wind. The Marketing Science Institute backed it with a massive research agenda that I was part of back in the early 90s. We see lots of evidence from the American Customer Satisfaction Index, from the Net Promoter Score advocates at Bain. Lots of positive evidence suggesting that more is better, and that good financial outcomes ultimately arise from doing this properly. We see examples all over us. Daily life, we bump into these examples all the time. Amazon, completely a customer-obsessed company. Uber has changed the way we are thinking about what we used to call taxis. Tesco has revolutionized, in its heyday, revolutionized the grocery market, going from number 3 in the United Kingdom to number 3 in the world when it was really firing on all cylinders. EasyJet, an amazing turnaround in a 5-year period, moving its share price from £4 per share to £19 per share, all based on a customer-led advocacy of an extraordinary person called Carol McCall, who led the airline at that time. O2 went from being a permanent, what was called a permanent value destroyer. It was worth about $3.5 billion, and within a few years had turned itself around on the back of a customer-led strategy to being sold to Telefonica for $17.7 billion. There's loads of evidence. It is attractive. It is obvious. Why is it so rare? We know, CEOs know this. CEOs know that this tuning into being customer focused is somehow a smart thing to do, and we see it in their statements. And here are two from famous chairmen or famous CEOs of companies. Many ways to center a business, of course, there are, and customer makes most sense. Earning lifelong relationships, one customer at a time, is fundamental to our vision. Indeed. So we can believe, I think, Jeff Bezos when he says this, and there's a lot to support and a lot of evidence to support that they really mean it. On the other hand, our friend from Wells Fargo, John Stumpf, was the CEO over a dreadful period of time and of customer abuse at Wells Fargo, which, he banned from the industry for life. He and another of his colleagues, huge fines. The company has been rebuked by the Senate and so on, all for mis-selling, inappropriate selling, all driven by bad targets being set for cross-selling, and basically the culture and the values and what was acceptable and what gets you a pat on the back changed fundamentally and went wrong there. So we cannot rely on CEOs saying things like customer first makes sense. We know that they will say this, and we went out and proved it. We asked more than 500 CEOs around the world, and they gave us their feedback. And you can see understanding customers is the most frequently named driver of competitive success. We then observed what they're doing in practice. We did this by using a number of scenarios and getting people to describe themselves through scenarios. And we saw there that being customer-led actually dropped. Being that trailblazing company actually dropped to about 24%. So a huge gap between the professions of belief and the actual following of the belief, which is not an unusual phenomenon in management. We find the saying doing gap in a lot of places, but we certainly have evidence of it in this sphere also. So given that it's so attractive, why is it so rare? And I'd like to ask Charlie to address this topic.
Okay, so it's a hell of a good question, and in our studying of the answer, it turned out when we started writing the book 7.5 years ago, we didn't know the answer. And what emerged, the first thing that emerged was what really matters, and what really matters in this question are people's shared beliefs across an organization about success. So shared beliefs are those sort of unspoken assumptions that we have when we're in groups, about kind of what goes down well and what isn't, and what goes down less well. And we're social animals, so we're very good at picking up what seems to matter in a group, and we're very good at sort of fitting in. And this is obviously true in organizations as one example of a group. And in particular in organizations, we're sensitive to what success seems to be and how success seems to be achieved. So Seán mentioned the phrase, you know, what round here seems to get you a pat on the back, and what gets you in trouble. You know, and you get clues from things. People don't tell you. So what do meetings get moved for? What's a crisis? What's, you know, which numbers are going in the wrong direction for people to really start caring? You know, and what gets the drinks trolley out, or the equivalent. So that was the first thing we learned. The next thing we learned, that there are two types of belief system that are relevant to this question, and so they're described on the next chart. So there's an inside-out belief system and an outside-in belief system, and inside-out beliefs start with the business and are kind of self-centered, and outside-in beliefs are customer-led. They start with the customer. The first thing I should explain on this chart is that we drew an analogy that we found useful. So in this analogy, the organization is like a planet, and customers are sort of floating in space. And customer-facing teams are on the surface of the planet, and they have quite a good sense of what matters to customers because they speak to them every day. But the people leading the organisation are right at the core, and they have layers and layers of organisation, teams, and complexity and numbers that tend to get in the way of them really seeing clearly what's going on out there. So they tend to see the world most naturally inside out. As I say, business first, self-centered, a bit like we thought the solar system worked before Copernicus, hence the name of the book. And for an inside-out organization, success is hitting the numbers or some version of that. And how? Well, a common way of achieving it is to set targets and maybe to gradually increase those targets over time, to give people rewards for hitting them, and to punish people in some way if they miss them. Outside in, so those beliefs are very natural because that's very normal, and that tends to sort of work in the short term. It tends not to work in the long term when the numbers get really high and you have to push like hell to hit them. Outside in beliefs are not natural, and outside in initiatives, customer-led initiatives, have some very awkward qualities usually. A typical outside initiative is the one in front queuing system that Tesco introduced, so that you know that customers don't like queuing. You devise a promise where you're going to open a new checkout every time there's a queue of more than 2 people. You work out in 1994 this is going to cost £60 million a year, but you don't know what customers are going to do when you do it. Are they going to come more often? Are they going to spend more per visit, or will they just smile and spend the same? And so literally, and you can't research it. Customers don't know themselves what they're going to do. If you find it, you show your competitors what you're about to do, so you're in a bit of a bind. Literally, you need belief or conviction to do it. And then we found another thing. We found that there's like a gravity, like you get with planets, that makes this easier or harder. So the next chart shows sort of different sizes of organisation. So if you're a startup, you're on a tiny little planet and you have very little gravity, and it's very easy to float off and to stay in touch with customers in the market and to be responsive and so on. Very easy to have outside-in beliefs. If you become a lumbering kind of corporation, it is immensely difficult to escape the gravity, the quarterly targets, the complexities, as I say, of the business that get in the way of you hitting them, the sense of what's going on out there beyond the traditional definition of your category and competitors is really hard. So the question then is, how do you escape this gravity? So let's assume that we're trying to answer this question for an organization with some scale. How do you escape this kind of inside-out gravity? And the next chart shows what we learned, along with a bit of a sort of diagram of the journey, because it is a journey. And we found that 4 things mattered. Something strange called burningness, that I'll come back to in a second. Then a series of things called moments of belief, that I'll also describe in a second. And then gradually it becomes more systematic, and then eventually it becomes purposeful. And there really is a deep-rooted belief that the organisation exists to serve customers first. I'm not going to talk much about the third, and the fourth. What's burningness? So burningness is a strange quality that can be either pain or fear or ambition. And whichever one of those it is, it's held so strongly that it feels like you're on fire. So pain is usually most effective because pain is it's going wrong now. So nobody argues. Fear tends to be a little bit less effective because it's fine now, but it's going to go wrong in a bit. So if you think about digital coming to lots of industries, Kodak, for example, if your business is going fine and next year's looking fine, why would you disrupt yourself and make things more difficult before you had to? So you wait. And ambition tends to be the weakest because ambition is entirely self-generated. So ambition says it's absolutely, your situation genuinely is okay, but for some reason you've got a real burning desire to get somewhere else. And that burning desire is enough to make you feel like you're on fire. And the point about feeling like you're on fire is that it flips the risk. So normally, the safest thing to do in business is to keep doing roughly what you've been doing up to now. And the dangerous thing is to try something bold that's a bit different. But if your business model is on fire, then it's madness to keep doing what you're doing. And the only safe thing is to take a step in a direction that you think is promising. And because of the nature of outside initiatives, having that sort of definite cost and slightly uncertain benefit, what we found is you need burningness of some kind before the organization will really seriously get into action. And then what happens is a first moment of belief. So what's a moment of belief? A moment of belief is something like the Tesco One in Front Queuing initiative. And what we found is that shared beliefs in a large group of people will only change if they see something tangible happen. And not only see something tangible happen, but see it work, and work not just for customers, because that bit's obvious. Obviously, customers like shorter queues, but also see it work for the business, because that's the bit that you're skeptical about. So when Tesco introduced the One in Front Queuing, and they introduced it and they did launch it, and it did work, then the belief goes up a notch that maybe a second thing like that would work. So they do a second thing, and then a third thing, and then a fourth thing. And gradually the moments of belief accrete and add up, and eventually the shared beliefs start becoming that every time there's a pattern here, every time we do these customer-led things, we seem to be doing better as a business. And actually I'm starting to get pats on the back for doing them, and I'm starting to get promoted for doing them. And the whole organization is now pursuing the kind of drumbeat of customer-led being the way that we succeed. And then you can see why you'd then be interested in making things more systematic, and then why eventually you might get to the sense that actually this organization really is here for customers. So we want to give you 3 examples of this in practice to bring this to life a little bit more. I'm going to give you 2 of them, and then Paul is going to talk a bit more than I will about DBS, which is a fantastic example of customer success and sustaining it. So the first of these is Tesco. So I've already talked about a bit of this, but let's go backwards a step. Where was Tesco's burningness coming from? Well, Tesco had this strange quality where they had a real chip on their shoulder. So originally Tesco was what they described themselves as a sort of scrappy upstart. They were traders. They were a bit messy. They spent a long time sort of with price being their advantage. And in the UK, Sainsbury's and Marks and Spencer were the establishment, and they hated them. They really hated the way Sainsbury's in particular was viewed as good in all that it did, and that Tesco was viewed as somehow inferior. And they so wanted to beat Sainsbury's. And this is particularly the sort of leadership group felt this viscerally. And over many years through the 80s, they caught Sainsbury's up, and they caught Sainsbury's up by benchmarking them, by copying them. But they couldn't beat Sainsbury's by copying them. So they were on the lookout for anything that might give them an edge, that might give them an advantage in their battle against Sainsbury's. This coincided with a group of people joining that were known as the Class of 82, and Terry Leahy was one in particular, and they naturally looked outwards. And when Terry became CMO in the early 90s, he did a big research study understanding where customers were in their relationships with supermarkets. And one of the things he found was that whilst the products and the prices were good, the experience of shopping was not. So he started realizing that maybe if Tesco could proactively improve the experience of shopping, then Tesco would be doing something ahead of Sainsbury's that might grow their share, that might end up leading them to win. And that's why they did One in Front Queuing. It was the first of a whole series, 200 in the end, of initiatives that they took that piece by piece, little by little, every little helps was their mantra and their advertising end line. They got better and better. So one in front queuing, then bagpacking. If you wanted your bag packed, you could ask for help. Someone would come. That was £15 million a year, and more and more, and so on and so on. The second example is EasyJet. So we mentioned them. They're on the next chart. So where did EasyJet start? Well, when Carolyn McCall first arrived in 2010, the business was established, and actually they were in crisis originally. So pain was the first of their kind of types of burning this. In particular, their punctuality had plummeted. Ryanair ran an ad at the time saying that EasyJet's punctuality was worse than Air Zimbabwe's, and the worst thing about that was that it was true. And that had happened because they got into a spiral of trying to cut costs to hit the numbers, and they gradually had not enough crew and not enough pilots to run the airline, and also sentiment was rock bottom, morale was very low. So Carolyn started reinvesting and started putting back in place things that would create the conditions for people internally to believe, and for them to get back on side, and for the planes to start running on time, because without that nothing else would matter. But then there was a second type of burning this. As she recruited a new team, a number of them were naturally customer-led, as she was, and they developed a sort of sense of purpose. And actually they were very deliberate about it, and they described what they wanted to achieve at EasyJet with something that sounds very boring actually, but they really meant it. What they wanted to achieve, their purpose at EasyJet, was to make travel easy and affordable for their customers. Now, discount airline travel was unarguably affordable, but it had become anything but easy. It was horrendous. And so EasyJet decided that they were going to set about tackling the things that most upset customers one by one. But their job was not to make it easy and less affordable. It was to make it easy and still affordable. So this is a serious innovation challenge. And so one of the first things they looked at was seating. So customers hated the race to get a seat because you didn't have an allocated seat. And conventional wisdom in the industry was that you couldn't give people an allocated seat because it took people longer to sit down. And one of the things that made the flights affordable was being able to go backwards and forwards with each plane 8 times a day, which meant you had to turn it around in 25 minutes. So how could you give people a seat and still turn the plane around in 25 minutes? And they worked at this for 1.5 years. And we know now that they found an answer. But if you imagine after a year of doing that, and I think the operations director was pretty skeptical, it would have been quite difficult to keep going and trying to find the answer. But eventually they found the answer, and they were inspired by Formula One wheel changes. And they learned that if you boarded both ends of the plane simultaneously in parallel, so you ignored air bridges and used the tarmac, then actually you only need to get half the plane to sit down in the time of your turnaround, and you could make it work. So that became a huge moment of belief that they could lead the industry and make things better for customers. The next one they looked at was pricing. I won't talk about it in detail, but they basically changed the way the European regulator regulated, so that everybody had to change their approach and everybody lost money. And then they found ways of earning money that customers would appreciate, and where they had choices, and that became the second big moment of belief. They had others to do with digital and so on. But that was the nature of their early part of the journey. So I think at that point, I'll hand back to Seán, and then we'll go to Paul, and we'll hear what the DBS version is.
I'll just say again that, thank you, Charlie. I just want to say again that Paul's role in the transformation of DBS, along with many other people, has catapulted from being an underperforming national bank, essentially, to being a very highly regarded, not just a highly regarded multinational bank, but regarded as one of the best. And these publications, which are the leading publications in finance, give it the accolade of Bank of the Year many times over, as you can see. But they've done that because there's been an intense focus on things like customer journeys, and really re-equipping the bank for the future, the new future, if we can call it that, the digital future. And I'd like to pass on to Paul now to really help us understand a little bit more about that journey.
Well, thanks, Seán. And firstly, congratulations on an absolutely fantastic book. I was just saying to Seán for the session that it really has captured for me a lot of the concepts that I recognize along the way of our DBS journey, and talks about the challenges of becoming customer-led, maintaining and sustaining customer-led, and more importantly, how to do that. And so as I was reading it, some of the concepts that we just heard from Charlie, I recognized, and they just didn't have names before, this idea about burning this. And there is a case study of DBS in the book around our digital transformation. But in fact, now I know the word for it. I know the first time I experienced burning this was back in 2009. It was the year I joined. And at that time, as Sean was alluding to, we were rock bottom. We've actually been quite kind. We were rock bottom. Our customer satisfaction results were the worst in the industry here in Singapore. And in fact, a true story, on my very first day in 2009, I got into a taxi and I said, "Can you please take me to DBS?" And the taxi driver said, DBS, damn bloody slow. And we had this reputation for being so slow and completely non-customer centric. A few months after I joined, our CEO, Piyush Gupta, joined. And he had spent his gardening leave in between his jobs doing a little bit of customer immersion, going to see for himself about this bank he was just about to take on. And it saw, queues out the branches and queues our ATM. And so as soon as he came in, the first job he gave me was, and he asked me to take on, was we need to differentiate ourselves on customer experience. I want to create a unique brand of service based on Asianness. We want to celebrate our Asianness. So this is 2009. We're coming out of the financial crisis, and we're trying to distance ourselves a little bit from the Western banks that are all going on the end of a cliff. So I said, I want you to go and define Asian service so we can really differentiate ourselves. And for me, this was the burningness moment, the kind of real essence that it was kind of a bit of pain and fear, but really it was ambition. To use your framing, Charlie. And then I trying to impress the new boss. I said, give me a couple of weeks and I'll come back and tell you. And he said, no, I want you to take 6 months. And, so we went and did a lot of work defining 96 different definitions of Asian service. And I went back to Piyush and I said, so I've got these 96 different definitions. What do you want to do? He says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the top 50 people in the company, and we're going to spend 2 whole days talking about these 96 and distill them down to something we can use. And we did that, and we ended up with this concept called RED, which stands for respectful, easy to deal with, and dependable. But the point about that process is exactly the shared beliefs that Charlie was talking about. We co-created, and coming out of those 2 days, there was just passion in the leadership team. And so, well, I said to Piyush, I said, so let's launch this thing. Let's get a program. He says, no, I want you to spend another series of months designing a program that really is going to mean something, and not just put red on mugs and T-shirts. So we designed a program of what we call process improvement events, or PIEs, which was these workshops, these 5-day workshops were aimed at taking waste out of our processes so that we could reduce the waiting time for our customers. We created a unit of measure called the customer hour. And we said, how many customer hours can we take out of our system on an annual basis? And we ended up that first year, we ended up taking 250 million customer hours out of that system. And the customers noticed a difference. And we went, in that first year, we went from bottom to top of the customer experience, where we stayed pretty much ever since. And the point about that is, in the very first PIE I ran, and I went back to Piyush and said, in fact, he walked in halfway through the 5 days. He looked at it and says, right, I've seen enough. We're doing 50 next year. So this was end of 2009. And then this is coming into 2010, he says, we're going to do 50. Right? And that's the moment of belief. I never had to fill out a business case and demonstrate success. In fact, the only thing we measured was a customer hour, and we didn't audit it. It was just an iconic vision for people to work towards. So that was really from the day one, we had these concepts in place. And for me, it's the foundation of everything that follows. I'll pause there and pass it back.
Thanks, Paul. And as you allude to, there were many more moments of belief that from that moment on, that really have transformed the bank and given it a shared sense of belief in its ability and its being at the center of banking ecosystem. And one thing that struck me from what Piyush has said is that let's not think about banking. No one gets up to get a mortgage; they get up to buy a house. Let's think about, as we were saying, the problem to be solved, the real issue that's going on. And it's not just a frame of mind; it's putting in place the ecosystems that we are having to that a customer would need to engage with. And it can do that through DBS. And you've made that very easy for customers. So it's not just, hard work, goodwill. There's a lot of IT infrastructure behind it. There's a lot of redesign, business system redesign that really makes a ton of sense. So I would just say, you've enjoyed tremendous success, as have the companies that Charlie talked us through during these periods of time. These were superstars. But we also know that companies lose it. And I want to address for a moment why that might be. We talked about O2 already, I think. We talked about Tesco going really exemplars at their moment in what it means to be customer-led. Lots of people wanting to learn from them, and indeed an awful lot to learn. But we also know that O2 was acquired. I mentioned that before at a fantastic premium, and now belonged to Telefonica. And as the decade went on, and we lost the confidence of the financial system, the global financial crisis was there. There was a tremendous pressure on a lot of companies to save cash, to hoard cash, and to look on profitable subsidiaries and to really pull finance back in, use them as cash cows. And we saw that in the case of O2, a company that had been acquired precisely because it had this specific competence. If you were to ask Telefonica, and indeed in the market, the analysts said so, why they paid what they paid because O2 had this special sauce that it could now bring to the rest of the Telefonica group. But what happened over time was it became crushed by the requirements of a very large, complex organization, which had colossal financial pressures of its own, and therefore stopped investing in the way that it had, stopped backing those moments of belief. You could say something similar happened to Tesco without the acquisition. It was enjoying a fantastic moment in the sun. And along came the financial crisis. That was probably one of the things that put the spotlight on it. But in the background, what had happened was Aldi and Lidl had grown market share. But if you're at 33%, even though it's going to hurt you when a little person starts to grab small pieces of market share, you're not so terribly worried. It's not like you have the same burningness that you had before. You just want to keep your position as the major and the market leader. But having the commitment and the will to actually make the investments, as Charlie has described, to back these moments of belief, that's hard. That's hard when your business in the United States has failed as a result of the financial crisis. It was just dreadful timing. A brilliant idea, dreadful timing, and they had to bring a halt to that at great cost. And the rest of the international businesses no longer could be funded by the home business, which had lost its way over time. So why on earth does this success last forever? We've described now two examples of it. It hasn't. But what are the common symptoms that we've seen over many companies? There are three basic ideas here. One is there are pressures from the inside, there are pressures from the outside, and lastly, there's new competition, which inevitably comes along. In the inside, you might think of a company like Virgin Atlantic. This Virgin Atlantic, what a wonderful example. It is the definition of a trailblazer, of a pioneer, buccaneering airline. With Richard Branson at its helm in its heyday, really defining what long haul travel should be like, and leading the industry with that. In fact, but it was sold. It became part of, through a number of transactions, it became part of Singapore Airlines, which also has a fantastic record for customer service, and one of the American airlines with a stake. It just became more concretely part of an enormous system. The burningness wasn't there. Still a great airline, and it didn't lose what it had achieved already. It just didn't keep going, and it just became pretty routine. So not the same as it was. And that's normal. This is the gravity that we've been talking about. It pulls you back in. There are also pressures from the outside. People become involved in the business who weren't part of the initial group, for example, and they have different priorities and different ideas about where the business could go. An example of this is Market Basket, the Mueller's Market Basket in the northeast of the United States, where you have shareholders, family shareholders who are never involved in the business that have very different ideas about what could work. So, for example, they're saying our strategy of paying employees way ahead of the market, we don't need to pay them that much. We could actually be a lowest. We can pay people more and still be so we can pay people less than we currently pay them, and we can still pay them more than the market. Exactly the same with customers. We could charge customers more and still be the lowest in the market. And that's what the outside shareholders, the non highly involved shareholders were looking for. They wanted to be part of this in a big way. They wanted more money faster. And the CEO at the time said, not possible, we can't do that. And the business went through a very tough time trying to deal with these people, and it suffered in the interim. The CEO wrestled back control, was managed to fight off that threat, but it was a significant threat. And competition. I mean, you know this example so well. Nokia was just the king of mobile phones, and I use that word very, very deliberately. The phones, the actual devices, and they were very device centric, and they innovated on the device. And they totally missed the ball, or weren't willing to react when they saw and realized what companies competing on ecosystems and operating systems were. So they lost their position in that market dramatically. And we see this again and again. And in each case, what's problematic is that burningness is being interfered with or is diminishing. In number 1 and 3, we see it's diminishing, and it's being interfered with in 2. That's why we don't think that this success will last forever. And it's almost inevitable that these pressures will be encountered. The issue is, how do you deal with those pressures? And very quickly, because I want to get back to Paul in a second, we have examples of great companies that have persisted over time. And what we see here is that there are essentially 3 key things that you need to worry about over time to maintain your customer-ledness. You need to know that a belief system matters. You need to pay attention to what is our belief system. What do people understand as shared belief? Why do people behave? That will tell you why people are behaving the way they are. What is success in our bank? And you need to pay attention to it, because something as almost conceptual as a belief system really gets in the way of practicalities every day of the week, and of business and decisions being made. You also need to ensure that there's a continual flow of moments of belief. You need to give people the reason to continue to believe. And you need, when you're challenged, as for example, John Lewis is now, you need to be bold. You need to really respond with gusto when you are being challenged by somebody who's seeing the industry quite differently. We could look at John Lewis as an example of an organization that really understands that beliefs matter. We could look at Hilti as an organization that understands that beliefs matter, but has had a series of moments of belief that have taken it from its core business, what an outsider would think of as its core business, to extend the definition and to really give a good sense of staying relevant to a changing market, and to being highly responsive to creating customer value in new and better ways given the new conditions. And in terms of being boldest when challenged most, I think you may be aware of the case of Lego, which has really had a dreadful and difficult time with the emergence of on-screen entertainment and toys for kids. for the digital solutions for childminding and all the rest of it. And they really struggled to find a way out of this. The way that they found out very successfully was to return to the core. That was a totally non-obvious decision at the time. Their core is 5 to 11-year-old children that actually play with their toys and really consume the value that is created by the toy. So I think in these examples, you have a recipe, if you like. The first, I think, is probably the most. They're all critical, but the first is the one where we see people losing out, because over time, the importance of that belief has diminished. Our understanding of the importance of that belief has diminished, as has our burningness. And I thought at this point we'd ask Paul to just reflect on, it's been a while, Paul, since DBS started its transformation. That burningness was there without a doubt, but how do you keep it going over time? It's more than a decade now.
Yeah, well, it's 12 years. Yeah. So, and you're so right that getting there is tough, but staying there is even tougher. And, we have not got this completely right through that decade. There's been moments where we've seen a dip and we've noticed a dip and we've had to, of course, correct. In fact, right now, we're going through a huge effort to rekindle, the belief systems and our focus on customers and being customer-led, etc. So I think that the secret is spotting it early, that when you see the decline. And one of the big triggers for us is you notice in your customer complaints, but just the frame that you have used around the 3 areas where you're continually under attack is just so relevant. So for us right now, with the low interest rate environment, our internal pressures mean that the low interest rate environment means the banks have less revenue. So this natural tendency is to look for other sources of revenue. And that usually comes in the form of fees. And there's this temptation to start charging customers for all sorts of things you would never dream of charging. So we've really had to be careful about doing that kind of thing and remain focused on the customers. Interestingly, today, the COVID situation is interesting, that I was speaking today to our head of the call centers, customer centers here in Singapore. And she was telling me that, in COVID situation, that all the people are now working from home. And in a situation where customers are complaining and we've got a difficult, challenging problem, no longer can they put up the hand and the supervisor comes out over to help. And that's gone. So we're having to solve that in creative ways to make sure they can get instant support. The outside pressures, it's really annoying that people leave DBS and new people join, because that dilutes this belief system. And I've made the mistake of not focusing enough on the newbies coming in and making sure they are, buy into this belief system. And we've had to go back and rectify that. And competition takes a number of different guises. One is that a lot of digital banks are now coming in Singapore. The regulator has issued some licenses to digital banks, so they're coming up. But I think digital in general, people are just used to good digital experiences, and therefore customer expectation is changing. And therefore, as you say, it starts to play with your customer ledness, as a word used, I think. So it's the huge challenges. And so how have we reacted to this in this shift right now? And the first thing is we recontextualize red. Red is still relevant. This idea of being respectful, easy to deal with, and dependable was very true in an analog world. But in a digital world, we had to reframe. What does respectful mean, for example, when your banking is on a mobile? And in some of our markets in the developing world, so India, for example, respectful means being respectful about the data plan for somebody, making sure that we're not downloading huge apps, etc., or using a lot of traffic, and respectful about people's battery life. Easy to deal with these world-class user interfaces, obviously, and dependable is about security and making sure the app's always available. So it had to recontextualize, but it was just fantastic that red is still holds true. But more fundamentally, we really want to do some systematic things now to really embed and make sure we can never lose our customer-led philosophies. And we really haven't done a lot of reorganization, but we're now reorganizing the company to be from the customer back, designed from the customer back. So all the people who need to get together and work together to solve customer problems now work together rather than have a functional kind of organizational structure. And each of those teams, and this is one I really love most, and it's mentioned a lot within your book, is this that the primary measure is no longer a dollar number. The primary measure has to be a customer experience measure, and not just any old broad-based customer experience measure. It has to be based on a fundamental understanding of the customer need. And we're inspired a little bit. So here in Southeast Asia, we have Grab, which is equivalent of Uber, and they have this kind of iconic customer measure. They, through understanding the customers really well, their iconic measure is the time it takes from opening the app to getting a cab. And that's what they focus on. They experiment and look for continuous improvements in that measure. And that really focuses on making sure that you maintain your customer-led philosophy.
Well, one of the things you mentioned there is, newcomers arriving and the effect that they can have. And there's a lot of merit in having newcomers come, bringing new ideas and stimulating thought and debate within an organization. One of the banks that we mentioned was Handelsbanken, and they ended up firing a CEO on the basis of a critical decision that he wanted to make. He wanted to introduce an extra layer. And they had 3 layers. They wanted to have an extra layer of hierarchy, and the board said no. I mean, this is a deeply held belief. There's a reason that this exists, and it's supporting an approach and a strategy. It's a part of our business model, and no, we don't think that's going to be okay. And to the point of it became an issue of departure. The CEO was no longer there. At Handelsbanken, they refer to something like a cork that keeps popping up in the water. So you have to keep watching out for the cork popping up in the water. This inside-outness will pop up. Toyota has brought in so many people into the organization outside of Japan to build and grow their business. They bring them in from Ford, from GM, from Fiat, from Mercedes. And they know very well that the Toyota way is critical for them, and they have to assert it again and again. They have trainings around it. They have case studies, which are in fact moments of belief that they help people understand how do we end up making this decision. There are a couple of questions which I think we can segue right into now. And for you, Paul, you've mentioned the customer journeys a lot, and I referred to the role of technology in enabling some of that re-engineering that has gone on. We also talked about putting DBS at the center of facilitating the big ecosystems that allow the fundamental purpose of banking to be achieved by consumers. So let's just say that from an outsider's point of view, DBS has achieved that. I think that's what the question is getting at. Where to next? Because that does present enormous opportunities for you if you wanted it. Certainly there are pathways that take you way beyond what we would think of as banking. I think this is the essence of the question. Where to beyond customer journeys does DBS go next, having achieved what it has achieved?
Well, it's a really interesting question, and it's a question that I think we haven't really got to the place we want to be. As you mentioned, nobody wakes up in the morning and says, "Hey, today's a great day, do some banking. Everybody come and let's do some banking together." This doesn't happen. So banking is always a part of a broader customer need. As the example you gave, buying a home versus getting a mortgage. So we're still in the very early days of building out ecosystems that really solve that whole customer problem. And using APIs and ecosystems, we are making good inroads. But our ultimate vision, our vision of DBS is to make banking joyful. And what we mean by that is to make it disappear, making banking invisible so it just works. I remember, we've used the Uber example a lot during this session, but I remember the first time I got out of an Uber and the payment was taken care of for me. And that was just a great feeling. I didn't have to worry about the cash, the change, just done. And that's what we mean for right across. And so if you think about how much banking infiltrates your lives, we've got a long way to go before we can claim we're done, and we even have to start thinking about the next thing. But we also, our philosophy is not, it's really just about continuous improvement. So I just can never see an end to just wanting to relentlessly remove friction from people's lives and solve those customer needs.
Brilliant, thank you. Mark Noble, good that you could join us, Mark. Mark has a question I'd like Charlie to address. Have you studied any non-profit organizations? Is there any reason to believe why your customer-led approach would not be effective in such organizations?
Yeah, great question. And in the book, we don't describe any, but we will be publishing in the next few weeks 6 more stories of customer-led success. And 2 of those are non-profit organizations. One is a kind of governmental organization, Transport for London, who exists to make the London's transport systems work well for the citizens of the city and for the country as a whole. And the second is really quite unusual. It's Glasgow Neonatal Birth Unit. So it's a unit in Glasgow Hospital that is for premature babies, and they pioneered an approach in what they describe as parent-centered care. So it's a situation where it's a world where technology tends to dominate because obviously premature babies are incredibly fragile, and you are terribly concerned with how they're doing and maintaining the conditions around them and so on. But actually, the person, Neil Patel, that leads that unit, learnt from what happens in some of the developing world when he went and had a look where the technology is not available, and saw parents being much more fully involved, and actually realised that a whole lot of things happen that end up producing much better outcomes for everyone involved, health outcomes as well as mental outcomes, sort of emotional outcomes, and setting people up strongly for success in that way. So we will be sharing those stories, and you can sort of sign up on our website to make sure you get them. And then just very quickly, experience with the foundation, we've worked with a lot of third sector organisations, and the battle is exactly the same. There are very big inside out charities who exist effectively to become bigger and to do more of what they do, or to keep going somehow. And there are those that exist to try and make a difference to the people they serve, and therefore tend to be much more innovative and challenging and freer to move and so on. So I think it's a great question.
Thanks, Charlie. I'd like to ask Paul, and Anastasia is really interested in trying to imagine what those early days were like. She asks, were you actively looking for early day proof points to showcase your transition in DBS? Was it easy to achieve early proof points to your customers? So you're proving them to your customers. So I guess my extension of that question is, for a moment of belief, 2 things have to happen. You've got to know it's working, but then the organization has to see it working for the customer and working for the organization. Were you on the lookout for that and promoting it and helping people understand what was happening, or just from a culture change point of view, how did that work?
That's a great question. And I would say, if I'm really honest, some of it was deliberate and a lot of it was by accident, but we were smart enough to realize when we stumbled across something smart, we'd keep doing more of it. But what we did is the very first ones of those process improvement events I was talking about, which were the foundation of taking waiting time out, we looked for the early ones where we knew we could make a big difference. We just looked at the process. You know what, right, we could do this, but we're going to go through the process and allow people to do it for themselves, and just give them just-in-time training for them to do that and empower them to make the changes, and so they can see quick change. And we ran this first one, and it was mail-in account openings. That's how long ago it was. And we went from a 15-day process to a 3-day process. But what we then did is, with all these, we did this with Post-it notes and butcher paper, and we took the artifacts from that very first workshop, and I posted them in the executive office on the executive floor of headquarters, and I sat on that floor whenever I could, and whenever I see anybody walking past, come and have a look at this. And this is how we, in 1 week, we crashed the waiting time, and now we're doing a few more of these. You should do some in your area, etc. So it's really, really important to show the story, and to drive this belief that this can actually happen. But especially in the case of DBS, where there was just not any confidence that we could ever get out of this rut, it was hugely important to kind of help with that shared belief and just ease it along. So very important.
We have just a few minutes left, and I want to honor the timing. Charlie, do you want to comment on the B2B question?
Yeah, just quickly. So I guess I guess the broad answer is we found that B2B, again, this whole thing is just as relevant to B2B as it is to B2C. The same pressures to be inside out versus outside in exist. The same challenges with being customer led exist. In the book, we talk about W.O. Gore and Hilti. Sean mentioned Hilti earlier. They're both big business-to-business examples, but they've both been exceptional customer-led organizations in their own right. One of the other 6 new stories that I mentioned is going to be Hermes Asset Management, who ultimately are concerned about the beneficiary of investment, but their market is with a lot of organizations and so on. So yeah, I just really wanted to confirm that B2B has the same gravitational challenges as B2C, and really understanding customers' problems that they want to solve or the outcomes that they want, and acting on that boldly and bravely is still the challenge.
Thanks, Charlie. I'm going to squeeze in one more answer. Ian Charles Stewart, Ian, great that you could join us, is asking, is the customer-led period inevitably always a counter pendulum swing to a cost optimizing period in all large organizations? Very briefly, I would say no. I think what I've seen in a lot of companies, and I'll mention a B2B, Danfoss, is that their obsession with optimization has actually been optimizing around these customer journeys. So if you can take, in DBS, they talk about straight through processing. And what is it called? Zero fault design. Is that what it's called, Paul?
Design for no ops. Is that one you're referring to? Design
for no operations. Thank you. So if you can optimize on the basis of taking out things that are going wrong, then you've improved the customer journey and you've saved a lot of money. Danfoss actually achieved enormous productivity gains by re-engineering for customer value. So I don't think that the things are juxtaposed at all on that question. There are other questions coming in. I don't think we're going to have time, and we will follow up with the questions that haven't been answered. And I hope that you all get a chance to have a look at the book and see what we're talking about. I'll leave you with an idea. Jeff Bezos has been the most provocative, I would say, campaigner on behalf of customer-led since the creation of the company. And he's always talking about day one. He wants to maintain the day one spirit. And what he's talking about there is actually what we think of as being customer-led. And continuing to have that sense of burningness. He's got a building called Day One, and he keeps that name with him, and he spends a lot of time thinking about this topic. He refers to day two as stasis, followed by irrelevance, followed by excruciating, painful decline, followed by death. And that's why it's always day one. And I think that's an appropriate place to leave this conversation. Don't forget that Amazon is not just a B2C, it's also a B2B business with the web services. Very, very successful, as you know. What will drive you on is the question. Where are you going to get your burningness? And I would ask you, I'd always love to send people away from a session with a question. And that's my question. Is it going to be fear? Is it going to be pain? Is it going to be fear? Or is it going to be ambition that keep that burningness alive? Keep day one in your organization, because that, I think, is the key question you have to answer. We'd love to have had more time to discuss all of these topics, to hear your questions, to hear more from you. But that's all the time we have. Thank you for joining us today. we will have a recording of this session, and you'll be able to get it and share it. So very happy if you would do that. Thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate it. Good to see you all. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Charlie. All the best.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you.